Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I hope you are well wherever you are. So while we wait a bit more until the rest arrive, we want to thank you all for joining us this morning. We are very impressed about the interest that this event has generated. And we can see there's our guests here already, and we can see also some of our students and some alumni from other years. So I'm gonna kick off. So welcome everyone to the Urban Design Otherwise series. This is the second year that we run this series of webinars. And so to make you, to put you in context, the urban design conversations were thought to be a space where we can collectively reflect on some pressing questions and challenges that urban design faces in the post-pandemic world. We believe that both academic and professional practice have to find new and more innovative ways of coping with the pace at which the built environment and society are changing. So my name is Laia. I am the graduate teaching assistant of the Building and Urban Design in Development program at the Development Planning Unit, University College London. Today, me and Professor Natalia Villamizar are going to be hosting this event, and we are glad to have such an inspiring lineup of guests. We are also very pleased, because we have among our guests two of our BUDD alumni, and we believe it is very important to build connections within our alumni network and also listening about the meaningful work that they are doing in different parts of the world. You will meet them very soon, and I'm sure they will have so many interesting things to say. But just as an introduction, I would like to highlight the purpose of this year's series. So why urban design otherwise? In this year's series, the focus on the concept otherwise, which attempts to make us think, is trying to make us think out of the box. So to navigate the space existing between what urban design does and what urban design could do. Talking about urban design otherwise means rethinking together how we can enact, foster emancipatory spatial practices. For that, we need to acknowledge the impact that the colonial legacy has made on our thinking about urban design. The traditional Western pedagogies, the traditional Western design, both in scholarship and in practice, which has been seen as universal, needs to be critically challenged to create and imagine new worlds. Recalibrating urban design thinking and practices will require an exhaustive examination of pedagogies and theories, but at the same time, it also requires talking and debating about how the outcome of the discipline can be reimagining. And as was said by Claudia Mareis and Nina Pem, how this can be done beyond the dominant Western solutionist and anthropocentric model of thought. So what are the possibilities for shaping a plural urban design by questioning how to decolonize our practice? How can such emancipatory practices and theories foster spatial, epistemic, environmental, and racial justice? So while we acknowledge the big challenge that these questions are posing to the future development of our profession, I'm going to give the floor to Natalia, who will present today's topic and who will introduce the first of our guests. So over to you, Natalia.
Thank you, Laia. I'm really happy to be here today. Natalia Villamizar, I'm part of the team at the BUDD program at DPU. Today, as Laia was telling you, we are in the second event of our series of Urban Design Otherwise. This specific event has been, it's about like reearthing urban design, thinking about radical theories and practices for this discipline that has been really important, and it's really important in shaping the way we live. As many of us know, an important part of the current debate on urban issues relates to the impact of climate change in cities and society. The latest IPCC report pointed out that more than 90% of all disasters are now related to climate change and extreme weather events, and that climate change is amplifying disaster losses in terms of human lives, livelihoods, and the overall economy. These losses are increasingly concentrated in urban areas. The IPCC report 40 points that if society as a whole doesn't act now, the frequency and severity of disasters and losses will increase. This data justifies urgent global action on climate adaptation, justifies to build resilient infrastructure and to implement nature-based solutions. However, Most of the actions being implemented are increasingly focused on technology solutions and the transformation of social behavior, overlooking two key issues: the actual misuse of these alternatives and the origin of this crisis. The misuse of climate adaptation has allowed corporations to offset greenhouse gases and continue their destructive business as usual practices by investing in climate adaptation. But I want to focus on the second issue here, the origin of this crisis, that Arturo Escobar refers as the crisis of the heteropatriarchal, colonial, and capitalist Occidental modes of dwelling that has eroded the systemic modes of living based on radical interdependence. That means that the current crisis is rooted on the separations of humans from non-humans and on the differentiations among humans themselves. In our last UD conversation, our guests, Leopold Lambert from The Funambulist and Cruz Garcia from Wade Architecture Think Tank, illustrated how, historically, design has been instrumental in realizing the separation between humans and non-humans, as well as reinforcing the differentiations among humans. In that sense, design, and by extension, urban design, constitutes a political technology that has been complicit in the spatial reproduction of privilege, on structural inequalities of violent legacies, realities that are central to the crisis we are witnessing today. To change forward and recalibrate urban design, thinking and practice, we need to reflect and revise our responsibility as agents of perverse practices and violence against the earth and the environment. In their book, Design Struggles, Claudia Marais and Nina Pan remind us that it is imperative that design and designers acknowledge and understand our own complicity in humanity exploitation of the environment and the reinforcement of normative relations that shape racialized society. However, they also join a growing group of practitioner activist scholars that, like us, believe that design can serve as a transition to create new ways of looking at the problem we have caused and to challenge current modes of thinking and doing. Design can become a transformative practice that allows us to imagine different ways to respond to our current crisis, ways that recognize the multiplicity of others, humans and not human, with whom we share this space called Earth, ways that engage with existing knowledge and practices to build the colonial future. Design can become a platform to advance what Vanessa Castan-Brot calls disruptive innovations, to set spaces that can break existing systems of thought and practice, that can help us bring the principles of healing and caring into our practices, that will allow us to move from climate adaptation to ecological reparation, and that will inspire a reearthing of urban design theories and practice. I am really honored to welcome today our guests that will share with us their contributions to a radical recalibration of urban design that brings the colonizing alternative for ecological reparation. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to Claudia Lucia Rojas Bernal. Claudia is a doctor in architecture from KU Leuven. She holds a master's degree in human ceremonies from the same university and a bachelor degree in architecture from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. Her research and design work has a strong focus on climate change adaptation, human settlement, landscape, and urbanism. Claudia worked as a leader of the Master of Urban Design at the University of Sheffield and as a teacher of urban design studios in Belgium and Vietnam. Currently, she's affiliated to the Department of Architecture and Design at the Universidad de la Costa in Colombia. Before giving the floor to Claudia, I want to remind you that you can, at the end of the presentations, you can raise your hand to ask questions, or if you prefer, you can write the questions in the Q&A window in Zoom. Thank you very much. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalia. And first, thank you for organizing this event to Natalia and the other organizers. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so the presentation I'm going to show is based on an urban design studio that I organized at the University of Sheffield, in which we were looking at the relationship between food and city. So, but actually this research started by thinking at the landscape as a palimpsest, finding the traces of the relationship between people and land by looking at old maps. And this tool helped me to approach Sheffield as a foreigner, and it's a way of working that I inherited from the OSA research group at KU Leuven, where I did my PhD. So initially, I was actually looking at the relationship between water and urbanization. That was what I worked on my PhD. But then I noticed that one of the particularities of the landscape of Sheffield were the allotments that have existed since the industrial time. And actually in the late 18th century, many acres of horticultural land surrounding this city, and probably half of the Sheffield families own an allotment. And currently the city manages 3,000 allotments over 70 sites. In 2019, we organized a symposium, Climate Care, with my colleagues at the University of Sheffield. And from a landscape perspective, this idea of care can be connected with the environmental movement that started to raise awareness about the need to understand the interrelations between social and ecological systems. And the book of Rachel Carson is a crucial step of the environmental movement. And this book, Silent Sprints, demonstrates how landscape perception serves to create awareness and to highlight the interconnection of the world. But we can also go back to ancient civilizations in which the relationship between societies and resource exploitation was mediated by cultural beliefs and also sensitive technologies. So exploring the food system was a tool to understand this interconnection between social and ecological systems. Because of course, on one hand, food production is responsible for 1/4 of the planet warming greenhouses, soil depletion, loss of biodiversity. And on the other hand, not everyone has access to a healthy diet, even though there is enough food to feed everyone on the planet. And this production of food actually has mediated our relation to the world. And it has transformed landscape and altered ecologies across the world and across scale. And the system creates a false idea of abundance independent from the weather conditions, geography, or natural cycles. And this led to a decoupling of food production places and practices. But food is also a central element of everyday practices and human identity, and it creates spaces of connection and conviviality in our cities. During the last decades, there has been an increased interest in urban agriculture and food systems, and there are several studies that explore the implications of urban farming, the relations of food systems on planning, and food as an element of culture. And in the 20th century, there were some projective approaches that explored how to articulate agriculture and urbanization as these two examples. But the reflection about the potential implications of food for the shape of and structure of the city have been limited. So the emphasis of our work was to advance in the understanding of the impact of food from production to consumption in the shape of the urban form. And the aim was to develop a methodology to visualize the multiple dimensions and special implications of food systems in the city, and later to design new productive landscapes and food spaces that support sustainable, inclusive, and affordable urban food systems. So the research develops an atlas that explores through different lenses these interrelations of food systems across scales, the meanings that citizens attach to food, and their implications in the urban form. And these lenses are based on the approaches proposed by Matthew Pottenger in the article Eating Places, And they allows us to explore the ways also in which citizens overcome the challenges posed by resource limitations and by the unequal distribution of food and the environmental impacts of global systems. And also working with food allows us to build a bridge between different geographies and different ways of thinking and different scales. Because we were working with international students, and this work is their work, and also, well, it was directed by me, but also by my colleague Ingrid Katz. So coming back to Sheffield, Sheffield has a rich story of immigration and faces huge challenges regarding food provision due to the social inequality in the city. So Sheffield is one of the most unequal cities in the UK, and there is a virtual division between the more affluent neighborhoods in the southwest and the more ethnically diverse and deprived areas in the northeast. So we have explored in detail the Lower Don Valley, that is here, and the districts of Burngreave and Attercliffe. And this valley has been radically transformed due to industrial activities and later housing clearance. And today is mostly an industrial site, but there remains pockets of housing. And due to ways of immigrations, these two neighborhoods are actually the areas more ethnically diverse of Sheffield. And this ethnic background reflects in these two streets that you can see here. And these streets agglomerate services, but also restaurants and grocery stores opened by the migrants, where food of their countries of origin is being sold and served. And they also create vibrant urban areas. So, the results of this work is this atlas that actually is a collection of maps, and they are very diverse. So we were looking at these food-related objects through these lenses that I already mentioned. This diversity is also the result of the complexity of mapping food systems, because they are not as concrete as water or energy systems, and these flows of food move through different infrastructures that overlap with other systems, and they are mingled with the public and private spheres. So these maps show the different intersections of food systems with the urban fabric. So through the first lens, food spaces, we investigate the urban spaces that mediate our relation with food, such as restaurants, kitchens, food banks, food halls, community gardens, and allotments. And these are the results. For instance, this map presents a network of farms that produce food for the organic box scheme regulator, and also the distribution network. And the elements of this network constitute one of the pieces of the infrastructural network that provide food to the city. This other map explores allotment site here, and these again are the two streets that I mentioned. And in this cartography, well, the students were showing the special arrangement and resources in one of these allotments, but also how the food that is harvested in the allotment becomes part of a network of changes that are structured by the social relationships of the garden. So some food goes to a food bank, or to their friends and their own house, and so on. These are cartography explores the central role of a food bank in Spitalfield, one of these streets. Its location, together with other social infrastructures, such as neighborhood offices of the Sheffield City Council that are somewhere here, they create a civic core that becomes a structural element of everyday practices in this area. And these sketches are showing the multifunctional role of a public dining room and community kitchen called a food hall. And this is actually a social infrastructure that tries to recover the role of the dining hall as an essential element of the city as it was during pre-industrial times. This other map shows how food streets create urban armatures or linear infrastructures that provide services for residential areas with a large offer of international food. That shows how global connections and the diverse background of Sheffield inhabitants permeate the urban forum. And again, these are the streets that we were looking more in detail. So we move to the other lens, the one food networks and flows. And here we use this concept to understand the different flows of resources, such as fertilizer, seeds, water, and energy, and also the infrastructures that allow the production and distribution of food. So this map is comparing the food miles of the content of an organic food box. This one with the crosses is this scheme regader, and also with the food bought at a local supermarket. Market this X here, and of course it's clear this need to shift from a global to a local system of food production. And this poses challenges in infrastructure, economy, and landscape change. In this schematic transect, the students explore the boring boundaries between rural and urban spheres, and how the suburbanization of the countryside calls for the development of new landscapes. And in this map is showing how the international food restaurants depend on a combination of local and global networks of food supply. And these networks are also established through social relations and personal ties with that the owners have with their countries of origin. This other map shows a network of community hubs that provide community meals and different type of services. And despite they have different philosophies, because one is a food hall, the other one is a food bank, and so on, they are all managed by the community, and they create nodes that structure the neighborhoods through food, and they also provide spaces for socialization. And through the last lens, food culture and narratives, we were investigating the cultural and political stories that are built around food and that support particular meanings. And here this ethnic background is represented through these dots, but also is combined with the subjective values that are related to food experience, but also to subjective values such as freshness and taste. And this other graphic is actually showing the recipes that are served in the restaurants at the streets. and how they encapsulate the feelings of belonging through taste, smell, and colors. And in this illustration, the students were showing the experience and special practices of the different actors that are related with the food system, but also they were exploring possibilities for new relations that could be established to create alternative food cycles. So we are moving now to the conclusions, and there are some conclusions that are very obvious, like food systems that can be understood as urban infrastructures, food spaces can be multifunctional, and food systems function across the different scales. And in the last part, there are more like questions for urban design that we try to explore later through research by design, but also we found that through food, we can also find some kind of actions of resistance, such as how they preserve identity for instance, the food streets and the allotments. And we ask how these food spaces, food production, and food infrastructures can be designed to support social inclusion and local identity through placemaking. Another action of resistance is this creation of alternative cycles through the recirculation of surplus and the redistribution and sharing of resources that are already happening in Sheffield and in many other places. And we ask for urban design what special interventions can support these practices of care that rebalance the social environmental interplays around food systems in Sheffield and in other contexts. And finally, another action of resistance is this decentralization and multifunctionalities. But of course, this requires more time, because we need to invest more time in taking care of the food and the landscape, and also a reduction of the scale. And here the questions for urban design is how the changes to infrastructure and landscape allow for this specialization on food systems and the city. And we then did some research by design, in where we were exploring how this could look like. And I'm going to end here and to give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Can you stop? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's been very interesting, and I think also our students might be looking at it very carefully, as we will be soon going to Sheffield for our field trip. So I'm sure it's been very insightful for them. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to introduce Alejandro. I'm very happy to have him here because he's a friend and fellow colleague of the BUDD cohort from 2019, where I was also studying. So Alejandro Torres is an architect by Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, and he holds a master in building and urban design and development at our school. So currently he's working as a planning analyst at the Peruvian Ministry of Housing, and he's also a lecturer of urbanism and design at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, and he's also a researcher in the research center CONURB in the same university. So he has several experience in research, design, and planning in the fields of infrastructure, urbanization, and territory. He has also worked for the public sector in Peru, and he has interests in the collaborations with local organizations, in transdisciplinary projects, critical design, and participatory processes for the sustainability of life. So today he will be talking about rehearsing tools and pedagogies in the context of indigenous communities in Latin America. And also, while he's presenting, I will post on the chat the link of a recent paper that was published by the Development Planning Unit in relation to also his presentation, so you can take a look to it more carefully. So Alejandro, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Lai, and thank you for the invitation for this event. It is great to be back to the school, so to say, and we are many hours apart, but it is nice to be back again in the BUDD environment after more than a year of finishing the masters. So thank you for that, and I'm going to share my screen now and to share you some thoughts on this topic. So please let me know if everything is working fine.
Yeah,
It's
very
perfect.
good.
Thank you. So my take is going to be probably a lot more theoretical and more oriented towards what researchers and academics are talking about, especially. So probably I'm going to, these are not going to be only my ideas, but lessons from indigenous peoples, activists, and academics in Latin America. And my intent here is to share on possible paths if you wish to explore this challenging endeavor. And also, this is something that I've read a lot and wrote about in my dissertation, and also things that I'm currently exploring with my research group in Lima. So first, I wanted to come back to start saying that the need for re-earthing comes from being explicit about the unsustainable forms of inhabiting the earth. And Natalia already talked about that at the start of the presentation, that Western and modern civilization has created these unsustainable forms of inhabiting the earth. And as designers, we play a vital role on how territories are inhabited and how they are shaped. So this notion of re-earthing, at least the first time that I read about it, was from Arturo Escobar. And he frames this necessity of re-earthing as follows. He says that Earth has been banished from the Earth, from the city, sorry, Earth has been banished from the city. And by Earth, he means both what indigenous cosmovisions frame and also what contemporary biological and social theory state, that is the radical interdependence of everything that exists, and that nothing pre-exists the relations that constitute it. So this might sound very abstract at first, but we will go deeper into what that it means for design and for our practices as well. So in Latin America, at least, the vanishing of the earth from our territories has materialized in immense landscapes of extractive operations, and also in the destruction, for example, of rainforests through its replacement by plantations and monocultures. So here we have a picture of how the region of El Chaco in Paraguay has transformed in 30 years. And it is important to state that these rainforests are not only natural beings, but we are also talking natural, so to say, but we are also talking about millennial cultures and indigenous civilizations suffering the dispossession of their lands, their health, and their languages. So we're not only talking about losing biodiversity, but also we are losing cultural diversity and valuable force of knowledge. Some forms of knowledge that may be critical for the current challenges of climate change, of ecological crisis. And this loss of cultural diversity is qualified by some critical scholars as cultural genocide. In the case of El Chaco, for example, we have a prominent scholar called Blaser that talks about how indigenous cultures, especially the Shiro, have tried to work with the Paraguayan government in many occasions, and how this has led to the dispossession of their lands. So we're talking about the occupation of these territories by unsustainable forms of inhabitation. And again, Blaser states that the modern Western civilization and its foundations operate in a way that it constantly negates the possibility of other worlds to emerge, worlds that might be more attuned to the earth. I won't get deeper into how and why Western modern ways of being are unsustainable, but there are amazing works by indigenous organizations and scholars and Latin American activists that I'm happy to discuss afterwards. Another example that I wrote about in my dissertation was about how the limitation of native communities in Peru is framed under a notion of division of different realms, like the property rights granted to native communities only consider the built environment, so to say, but the forest, the rivers, and the subsoil are separated from what the community is understood. Contrary to that vision, indigenous cosmovisions like the proposal of the One Piece Nation here on the screen is frames the territory as a relationship between different beings. So, between, for example, the aquatic space, the space of the sky, the space of the earth, and different beings that inhabit these spaces with them. So in the face of the consequences of these unsustainable practices of Western civilization, in which design has been an important part, there is a call for looking into other principles that could be more attuned to the earth. And some authors talk about relationality, of comunalidad, that is a way of understanding community relationships in Latin America, and lives more attuned to the earth, right? So, but this, I prefer not to stay in a dichotomy between modern and colonial ways of being and non-modern or other ways of being, but to get deeper into some nuances that can appear. So, for example, regarding water governance in Peru and Colombia, Astrid Ulloa and other authors tell us about at least 4 different meanings that water can take in the context of water governance. So they say that water in this context can become an economic good or a commodity that can be known, appropriated, or exploited. And here we can think of how when we pay our water bills and how water is exploited for profit in some contexts. But water can also take the form of a human right, a fundamental right that shouldn't be denied to people, and that everyone should have a minimum of access in order to secure their rights. But water can also become a collective good, something that needs to be protected and managed collectively, or as by a community or by communities of organizations. And lastly, the fourth meaning that water can take in this context is as a non-human right. Is a non-human with rights, which is constituted as a political actor. Here, this understanding is probably more related to indigenous cosmovisions, but we must also be aware that these different meanings that water can take are not mutually exclusive. Some organizations frequently enact different water meanings depending on the occasion. So what about this example? This is something that I'm going to use later to think to frame what it means for design to operate under these different meanings, right? And in the case of urban design, in the role of urban designers, the book Designs for the Blue Rivers by Arturo Escobar asks this question and tries to answer some nuances about it. Specifically, he reframes the phrase design for the real world as a question where designers ask themselves for which world we're designing and what kind of design we're practicing and what we mean when we say about that something is real. In the case of urban design, I think that at least two important questions that we might ask is what we mean when we say that we are practicing, which urban we mean, at least, and what design we're practicing. And keeping in mind that those questions are probably going to stay open during the design process. And about the urban, we can relate to different frameworks or points of view that we're using. So And what type of urban we enact is key to the results of urban design. So are we talking about urban design as a physical form or a place? Or we're talking about urban design as also a place, but for capital accumulation, for example? Or do we understand urban as a metabolic process, or from the everyday life experiences of people? We can also take into account the unequal distribution that urban form can take in access to resources, to political power, and others. So, for example, coming back to the example that I took from Ulloa and others about the different ways that water can be, or the different meanings that water can take, what it means, for example, for urban design when water is enacted as a commodity, right? In the case of a city like Lima in Peru, the evidence shows that water as a commodity results in the production of inequality and many times in the toleration of it. Here we have a map and some diagrams that show how the central districts of the city, and normally those with higher incomes, have a much better access to water than districts with lower incomes, and also that in many cases, the minimum amount of water recommended for having a decent life is not accomplished. So what would happen if instead of a commodity, water would be properly treated as a human right, for example? What it means that for urban design. Here in this drawing by Ronald and Kahima about Inca's water systems, we understand the relationship between humans and earth was about collectively taking care of the territory for securing the collective good for the community, for securing water for everyone. And this is something that still happens in many communities in the Andes, in many peasant communities. And there are also interesting works between organizations and local communities for securing these water rights and collectively managing water security and water infrastructures. And these water infrastructures are not only something physical, but they are related to rituals or spatial practices that are part of the everyday life of these communities many times. And finally, what it means, for example, to design when a river is a person with rights, for example. What does it mean if we take seriously this statement that indigenous communities frame many times, that a river can be a person with the same rights and that deserve the same recognition as another person, like a brother, like someone we relate to. This might seem very abstract at first, but when we recognize that rivers and other non-humans maybe you want to call them ecosystems, for example, they can literally be killed by oil spills, by mining, by sewage, garbage, when its fish, plants, fungi, and its relations are dead. And this can happen both in cities or by the activities that cities perform. Then it becomes more clear that rivers and other similar beings are very much alive, and taking this seriously might be a path for reearthing our cities, right? And these are some ideas that I might share regarding principles for this endeavor, and what some authors have stated, that principles of relationality, of radical interdependence, of comunalidad, of taking seriously everyday life practices or justice with other species might be necessary principles for this reearthing. So about some tools that designers might enact for putting this, like I said, life at the center. Some authors, like Elizabeth Sweet, talks about cultural humility and the collaborations that designers can start creating with citizens in general. So Esi Mancini here talks about what happens when everybody designs. And here is one important step that designers can take into collaborating with organizations, with communities that, and and start working at the same level, not as expert designers isolated in a studio, but working more closely with organizations. So the outcome of the design process becomes a collective endeavor, a collaborative and a collective endeavor. And here we had a nice experience with the BUDD program a couple of years ago with the Moravia, in the Moravia neighborhood, with Moravia Resiste and other organizations that were working there. And we listed some spatial practices and knowledges that were important for them regarding recycling and waste collection as a part of their culture, as a part of their living heritage. And it is not only about, for example, mapping the spatial practices, but also how we collectively mapped how these become metabolic processes throughout the city. So this was an interesting collaboration where local knowledge was valued, and we were able to learn from that and collectively portray the importance of these practices for the sustainability of the neighborhood and sustainability of the city. And also other tools that some authors state, and this is something also that I wrote about in my dissertation, is an important part of translations and conversations across worlds. The first time that I read about these was in the work of Marisol de la Cadena. She has a very nice book where she states how she has had interesting conversations with peasant communities in the Andes, especially a couple of collaborators. And in this case, at least for the country, and I think that for Latin America in general, in a country with an immense diversity of ecologies, of climates, of peoples, the practices of conversation, of sustaining conversation across different worlds, across different meanings between what it is, our territories, our lives, is very urgent. So the articulation, for example, between Andean, Amazonian, and rural life words needs to be taken seriously, right? And here we are talking about, for example, I've learned about nice examples where, for example, the forest department of California was starting to work collectively with Yurok communities in North America to recover the controlled fires that they used to do. So this was a collaboration and a way of using also new technologies and new equipment for a controlled practice that was already been done by the communities in past times. And this was a recovery, something that came back after many years. So I'm going to skip this one. And this practice of sustaining conversations across worlds, and this notion of translations can be also be developed, for example, in these proposals about, for example, recognizing the rights of nature, or other proposals as that comes from indigenous communities. So, for example, in the case of rights of nature, De la Cadena argues that these are a form of translation where indigenous peoples have framed their knowledges and their priorities of respect and brotherly relationship with nature and earth under a modern Western tool that is law and rights. So it's an attempt to translate their cosmologies and their priorities into something that, for example, the state can understand. And this is an example of a bill proposal for recognizing mother rights in Peru. But we have also other examples. For example, the One Piece people elaborated with the support of anthropologists and lawyers their status in 2015 for the constitution of their autonomous territorial government. And they produced a series of what they call socio-technical documents, where their principles of life and respect for the territory are embedded in a document that is also attuned to be communicated, for example, in a legal format document, so to say. So it is also about, for example, design to using maybe other types of tools beyond the physical design. So language, policy, law, activism, and even community organization can become a part of what design do. And it becomes also very political. And finally, another idea that I wanted to portray that I learned also from the One Piece people is this notion of co-design with the territory, and giving, how can we give agency of non-human beings, for example? How can we allow for nature, so to say, to actively shape our human design, our urban design? So for example, in the case of the One Piece autonomous government, what they have portrayed is their government structure resembles the hydrogeographic configuration of the territory, composed by two river basins. And in their case, each basin has their own sub-government with specific autonomies, and main authorities are elected and alternated between these basins. So what we see in the case of the One Piece people is that the configuration of the territory is reflected in the configuration of the social organization as well. So finally, to close, what I wanted to show you is also that design can take many different forms, and I believe that some of these forms are more attuned to this endeavor of reearthing, when we acknowledge that everybody designs, that everybody can design, and we can collectively and collaboratively produce design, that we can go beyond physical design and embrace other formats like policy, law, language, etc. That the territory or nature, so to say, can also be an active agent in our processes. And that in these cases, design probably must take a very political form. And yes, those are my ideas, and I hope that you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Okay, because we are mindful of time, we are going to move fast, so we can go to introduce Martina now. So Martina graduated from the Building and Urban Design and Development program as well. And since then, she has been working as a community build manager for the environmental education charity called Global Generation. And she has been overseeing the participatory design and construction of the Story Garden in King's Cross in collaboration with the Practice of Architects. So also in January 2022, she will be taking over, or she has been taken over as a joint director of the charity with a specific focus to her role on site developments and partnerships. So today Martina will be presenting Reearthing the Commons, and she will be talking about the work of Global Generation with some specific cases in London. So Martina, over to you. Thank you.
Has that worked? Can you see the whole screen?
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. Okay, hello. So this presentation might be slightly different to the ones we've just seen, as I am, I suppose, presenting from the position of kind of being on the ground practice. So I don't have very many kind of maps and data as some of the other presentations have, which, although actually I think would be very useful and a good thing to look at having. So I just quickly first wanted to introduce Global Generation as a charity. So we are an environmental education charity, and so we've been going for about 19 years, and what that has essentially meant is finding ways to help young people in the city to connect with nature. And the way that that has historically worked and still is actually partnering with development. So with the developers around King's Cross Estate, Euston, and down in Canada Water. And up until this point, we've primarily worked on a meanwhile site basis. So it's been creating temporary spaces while those areas are not in use, where we can create gardens and run our programs, but then those spaces have gone back to the developers afterwards. But we are kind of at a point of flux where that way of working is changing. So the kind of guiding principles behind the way we work is the notion of I, we, and the planet. And that's the idea of developing self-awareness and self-reflection in our practice, building strength in relationship with others, and then looking at practical action and leaving a positive legacy of social environmental change. And that's both for ourselves as a staff team and how we work, but also with all of the different young people and community groups that we engage with. So this is an image of the Story Garden, which is one of our current sites. So this, some of you might know where this is. So this is next to the Crick Institute here. That's St Pancras Station. And then on this side where you can't see is actually the British Library. And this face here runs along Osselton Street, which is essentially the border between the King's Cross estate and Somerstown. So we're kind of in a really key sort of central position there that is kind of straddling different communities and institutions. So the Story Garden and the way we work at the Story Garden has been quite interesting and has actually had to change quite a bit throughout the pandemic. So we, as I said, our main focus is environmental education. However, having the space at the Story Garden, this is, I think, 2.8 acres. So it's actually the biggest site we've ever had. And what it's enabled us to do is have these beds here, which are community grow beds. So these are for the residents in the Somerstown estates who don't have access to outdoor space, who don't have access to growing space. They can come here, they can grow vegetables, and they can actually teach us about the foods that they grow. Somerstown population is largely Bangladeshi, as well as obviously different ethnicities as well, but there's a huge Bangladeshi community there, and that's been an incredible learning experience for us as a garden team also, to learn about the different food that they grow, different ways of cooking, and different ways of relating to nature, bringing in that culture and that heritage and those stories to the way that we learn together. So this here, you can see there's a lot of families, so everyone brings their children. We're opening on a Saturday, and we run Family Saturdays, so there's activities for children, but it's also an opportunity for residents to come and look after their beds as well. And this has been supported by Camden Council, as well as different other funds, which has included training and seed production. We're in the process of setting up a community nursery, which will essentially be a training program for local people to learn about food production, and that's with an AQA accreditation, and with the idea that that can actually lead to employment in the development of this area, in terms of those plants can actually be purchased and go out to the different sites that are being developed between Somerstown and Euston. But actually there is potential employment opportunities for landscaping and garden maintenance for local people who would have gone through our training programs. You can see here lots of the different programs that we run. So we work a lot with primary schools, with community groups, with secondary schools. We run after school clubs, a very wide variety of programs around lots of different things. Food is a big part of it, but also just that idea of self-reflection, creative writing, storytelling, kind of grounding ourselves in nature and in our spaces. So coming back to how is this kind of looked at from a wider urban design perspective, I think for me, one of the key things that is different about how we operate is that partnership with developers and with corporate groups, which is sometimes questioned. And I think that it's a grey area, and we're kind of always balancing, kind of straddling the different sides of that relationship. And there are definitely developers that we wouldn't want to work with. There are lots of questions around that. How do we decide who we would want to partner with, who do we not, and how does that come across to local people as well? And we have had issues, like when we first opened the Story Garden, it took a while for people to come in and to trust us, and to not kind of just feel that it's kind of a greenwashing project where, you know, we're putting this here but it's going to go, and it's kind of kind of not really for local people. And I think that that has been a problem that we've overcome mainly through our programs and through actually bringing people into the space and ensuring that their voice is heard. And just to quickly backtrack slightly, the development of this space, we worked with Yankatine Architects, and we worked on the basis of a common plan rather than a master plan. So we essentially started just with a couple of buildings. This roundhouse was actually not there at the beginning. So there's the toilets over here, you can't see, but there's a community kitchen, and there was a classroom, and that was pretty much all that was on this site when we opened. And the rest of the site has then been developed through a co-design and co-build process. So we work with all of the different groups who come in and use the space, as well as running regular volunteer sessions, and all of the things that you can see in this picture, as well as many others, have been sort of built and designed by those people coming into the space. But yeah, so back to how we work with corporate groups, and I thought this picture was quite good to represent it, that we actually had a group quite early on. We had a lot of construction needs which we couldn't really do through a co-build process just because of the skills needed. So this roundhouse was one. We actually worked with Central St Martin's University for their architecture program, and the architecture students designed and made the framework of it. But then in terms of doing the roof, the insulation and kind of various other larger construction, we actually needed pro bono support, and we also just didn't have the funding to run it as a co-build. So one thing that was really key to that was actually, how do we work with institutions? How do we get them to understand the value of what we're doing? And so we ran a session with the managing directors of a lot of Skanska's supply chain, who are responsible for a huge amount of construction around the country. And we invited them in, and we shared food, and we sowed seeds, and we had a session where we sat in this circle of oak trees, and we spoke to everyone about getting them to recall a memory of their childhood for their connection to nature. And through that discussion, I think everyone suddenly got it. They understood why these spaces were important. They understood the value of keeping these green spaces in our cities, and the value of working together to ensure that that happens and remains. And by the end of that session, we had a pledge for probably around, was never completely valued, but around £250,000 of pro bono support, which included working with local volunteers and like King's Cross Construction Academy, Westminster Kingsway College, so kind of different construction courses for young people as well, so that the professionals would work with the young people, and the building of these spaces was part of that training program. This quickly to show, this is another one of our sites down in Canada Water. So this is the paper garden, and on this site we're working with British Land. Again, this is a temporary space, but we have currently got a lease for 7 years with the idea that that will be extended. And this space has been very exciting, and actually one thing that having temporary structures allows us to do is actually be very creative and explore new ways of building and new ways of working that we potentially can't do if it's more permanent, or potentially we can, but this has kind of been a very good test bed for some of those ideas. And so here you can see we've got young people cutting up logs. So these logs were donated, these trees in fact were donated by Epping Forest. They've then been dried on site, so it was greenwood that we brought in. It's all been cut and stripped back by the young people and school groups that we work with, and then we are testing out a technique here that you can see called cordwood. So cordwood is essentially using wooden logs in the same way you would potentially do like dry stone walling, so kind of building them up, and it's infilled with lime mortar. And there's hardwood sleepers around the framework. This is going to be quite a large double-storey building, and it's the largest double-storey building using this technique in the UK. And it's a very sustainable way of working using local materials, and really lends itself to that co-build process, because it's something that actually everyone can very easily, it's quite messy, it's quite fun, you can kind of get involved, lay some logs. So that's been really exciting, and it's also currently the largest circular economy build in the UK. So two of the facades are using this technique, and the other two are using windows which, due to regulation changes, are no longer the right size for new construction in the UK. So we've now been donated those those windows. So it's kind of using materials that would otherwise be waste. So the sleepers here, for example, were donated by Network Rail, who we've got quite a close relationship with. They've also provided labour. And it's kind of building those partnerships and relationships where that enables us to then actually also bring community groups and young people into that process, into a process that otherwise they wouldn't have access to. So just quickly then, so we've also recently bought a boat which will sit on the Regent's Canal just outside of Granary Square, and that's going to be a floating garden. So that again is looking at how do we bring this green experience to different areas, and I'll talk more about King's Cross and Somerstown in a minute, because I think that's the main thing I want to discuss, but just this was quickly to show you some of our upcoming projects. So this is currently in the boatyard, but should be returning to King's Cross in around 4 weeks, and then we can start the process of building with young people. We've got our generators group, who are a after-school group. We've got our food and climate and food action ambassadors, who are a group of young people aged 16 to 21, and both of them, those groups will be developing different spaces on this barge. This is quite a landmark event for us. This is a site that will be over just outside of York Way, and this is the actually first of its kind in the UK, or at least in London, where we have secured this land for community use on a 999-year lease. So it's essentially, for us, it's permanent, and it will be the first time that we're not having to kind of pack up and move everything after a few years. So that's really, really exciting. And this space has the purpose of also being a wildlife and ecology site. So alongside running all of our other programs, and again, going through a co-build and co-development of this site process, it's also very much about those other beings, the other non-human animals in the city, and how do we create spaces for those, and how do we learn and teach and bring those spaces to life in a way that people can understand and value. So quickly going back to Somerstown and the Story Garden. So the Story Garden is actually on British Library land. So you can see there the British Library in the background, and this space will be developed. So at some point they're going to build an extension of this site, probably in around, we've just extended our lease by 2 years. So that's the kind of time frame we're looking at. And for us, the key piece of work we're working on at the moment is the legacy of this site, because it has been hugely successful in bringing people into the space. It's really, really well used, and actually in consultations, we've recently heard from Lendlease, who are doing consultations around the Euston development, that one of the key things that they keep hearing about is how people want more spaces like this. And the fact that this space is going to go is very much it's seen as a great loss. So the key piece we're working on at the moment is what is the legacy of this site? What is the lasting impact of having spaces like this in our city, if they are meanwhile? Of course, we'd like them to be permanent, but where they can't be, what happens afterwards? So we are working with a lot of the housing associations. We're working with Camden Council. Again, we're working with developers in the area, we're working with schools, we're creating school gardens, but we're developing green spaces in all of these estates that you can see. So in the courtyards of these spaces, we're calling it our Green River across Somerstown, sort of essentially from York Way, where our triangle site will be, down to Regent's Place in Euston, and looking at this patchwork of green spaces. How do they connect? How are they used? And also being very aware of our own capacity as an organisation, that we don't want to run these spaces. What we want to do here is help to initiate and train people up and help spark that interest in these spaces, so that they can then be taken over by the local community and we essentially aren't needed anymore. So it's very much to do with initiation and support, rather than us having more garden spaces that we run from. Part of that, quite interestingly, the British Library have been really supportive of our work and are quite interested in us doing a kind of, if you like, legalized occupation of the piazza. So actually, do we bring some of these growing beds, the make space, those community workshops? We've got kilns, we've got laser cutters, we've got all sorts of machines that people can learn to use. Does some of that become part of the British Library? And I think it's, for me, the value of having these spaces and these partnerships is the fact that you start to open up different ways of working and a respect for different types of knowledge within some of these institutions that otherwise can become quite stuck. So the fact that the CEO of the British Library right now is contemplating how can this develop, how can we work together, and what is the value of that space, which is essentially a public space in the heart of Somerstown, which is massively lacking for green space as an area. It's well below the kind of recommended average. And it's very much in an area of extreme social inequality, where you've got these super rich, you've got Google, you've got all these intense businesses, and then you've got these estates right next door. And there is such a disconnect between those different worlds. And I think the British Library has been seen as a bit contentious space that people feel like it should be public and it should be for them, but they don't feel like they can come in. So actually, I think it's showing the value of these spaces and how it can work, and enabling those conversations with developers, with institutions, with the council, of actually what can really be done here and how can we develop these areas differently. That for me has been the biggest sort of learning curve and opportunity that I see going forward. And then just quickly on that, I think it's also part of a bigger question. So this is the Camden Green Loop that is currently being developed, again with the council. You've got the High Line here. Our triangle site will be pretty much here at the end of the High Line, and then the area we're talking about is here, and then our boat will be here. So we kind of see our space as kind of cutting through actually this green loop. But I think it's about having the conversations with the council and with the people developing these urban greening strategies, and seeing how do we work together and bring those spaces together as one project. Thank you. And of course, just to end on the importance of all sharing food and eating together.
I want to thank you all. Thank you, Martina, Alejandro, and Claudia, for these inspiring contributions that are evidence of how we can challenge current models of thinking and doing, and how we can bring disruptive innovations into urban design from academic, research, and practice perspectives. I think this has been an amazing panel. I'm really happy to be co-sharing this space with Laia. And I will give the floor to Laia to start the Q&A section.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, everyone. As said by Natalia, I think it's been really inspiring hearing from all your experience, also from, as we said, our alumni, how are they doing in different places of the world. So thank you very much. So what are we going to do now is to go through the Q&A. So we have some anonymous questions. So I'm going to read it. And while Claudia, in this case, replies to the question, we are bringing, as you can see, some of the other persons to panelists, so they can directly ask to our guests. So if you guys feel you want to write your question in the Q&A, you can do so. And if you want to directly interact with our guests, you can also be promoted to panelists, so you can have a conversation with us. So the question, let me go through it. We have for Claudia, I guess, is Sheffield, like many cities, has been severely impacted by cuts of services benefits, Brexit, rising living costs, and the pandemic. Did you find the systems help the most vulnerable citizen in Sheffield? Food banks across the country have increased in this period, in some areas almost tenfold. What was the situation in Sheffield? So to you, Claudia.
Yes, so I have to say I actually moved out of Sheffield, but so I didn't really study in detail these topics during the pandemic, but I know that in Sheffield also there was an increase in the demand of food from the food bank. And also there was an increase of the allotment demand. So because people had more time, they also were investing more time in growing food, and I think this is important. But I also would like to say that there are these situations where you have these emergency situations, and also in Colombia, there was this kind of in Bogota, distribution of food parcels to the more poor people. But also, for instance, in Sheffield, in Chile, during the protest of 2019, there were also some kind of new networks of people organizing themselves to, let's say, cut the intermediaries in this food system, so they could buy cheaper food and redistribute it, and they create like kind of community for that. So yeah, I think these emergencies bring these opportunities to for these networks to grow. But I also have to say that I don't think that these food banks are a solution, because they are supposed to be just a temporary solution, and they have been taking this kind of more important role. And the idea that we explore in the studio that I didn't show was also how this food bank can be transformed, so people don't have to rely on it in the long term, and that requires also to change the whole system. And this is what I think is radical in a way, and it's difficult, but it's necessary.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Now moving to our new panelists here, we have the first question from Alban. Hello, Alban.
Hello, everyone. I was just wondering, it's a question for Claudia and Martina as well. How can we secure these growing spaces in cities given very much reduced local authority budgets and increasing housing pressure? So the 999-year lease, for example, was especially interesting. How did you manage that?
To be honest, so I've only been at the charity for about 3 years, but I think it's through an ongoing relationship with Argent, who are the developer for the King's Cross estate. So I think even up to 15 years ago, we were working with them on kind of small plots of land that have then just gradually grown. And I think it's that relationship and that trust and kind of proving through doing, I think showing the value of these sites through actually actively making it happen and showing how it can work. And that's why for me the 999-year site is so exciting, because I think it really demonstrates to other developers like how these kind of brownfield sites and these kind of wasted plots of land, if you like, and also to Network Rail, who are a huge landowner in the area. So the Triangle site is kind of bounded on each side by the railway tracks, and I think Network Rail have been very kind of wary of using those sites because of issues with access to the tracks. So I think again it's leading through example of showing how it can work and how it can be a benefit rather than something that's kind of a risk and something to avoid. And again, I think for food growing sites, similarly, it's been showing to kind of the council, to landowners. Again, we're putting in growing spaces in schools, so young people in the schools can learn how to grow in a practical way. I think it's happened through demonstrating that it can work, essentially.
Yeah, I think Martina replied to most of the question, but I have to say also, like from Sheffield, like you saw how the allotments now are going farther and farther and farther, but actually in the city center there are many underutilized spaces, like these parking lots, and everywhere you have this new housing, and there are more parking and more parking, and yeah, I think like this emergency demands also to change the way in which this housing is designed. But I see also from governments, for instance, in Colombia, they are already starting to think in other types of infrastructure, like solar energy, for instance, and they are committing to bring this, and also this requires a space. So I hope also that this growing food in the city becomes something that is part of the agenda of the city planning as well.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I think Bobai had a question to Alejandro, probably, right?
Hi,
Hello.
thank you for giving me the chance. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, this is Bobe. I also was in the BOD program in 2017-18. I don't remember, but a few years ago. But now I work as a regional gender and climate change expert in UN Women, Asia and the Pacific. So we have this project about gender and climate change. So we set the women and also LGBTIQ plus groups and indigenous groups as agents of change. And also we have this notion of climate change impacts differently to different groups. So when I was hearing you, that Alejandro, that you were saying that we could set the non-human beings as active agent of change, that was really interesting because we were more focusing on vice versa. Like we were focusing on the impacts of these non-human beings because of the climate change, but we didn't set these as, you know, active agents. So I was wondering what if we position these non-human beings, which includes nature, including rivers or whatsoever, and also urban environment, in a stance that which could be really fluid and it could be multi-dimensional, instead of setting these non-human beings as just one group, you know, because I think you set this notion with underlying of analysis that these interacts with differently with the different human beings and different human groups. So if we position these like non-human beings in a fluid, really relative, multi-dimensional position, do you think that would have like they could play different roles or more effective roles when they are also part of this co-creation and co-producing of these changes that you're talking about? Over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you, Boba. I think that your question is very interesting in the sense that, especially when we think about climate change and, for example, extreme weather events, we can start thinking on these non-human beings in another way. So how they affect us, because extreme weather events will have important repercussions to cities, to different settlements, to different groups of people, also in differentiated ways. I'm very sure that is something that we must take into account. So it is also important, for example, not to romanticize this idea of non-human beings, but also to take it into a new, with a nuanced understanding. So what they are, there is not only one type of relationship, but probably many different types of relationship. That's why I wanted to stay away of the dichotomy between, I don't know, Western and indigenous understanding. There is not such dichotomy. There is a diversity of ways of relating to nature, to non-humans, however you want or to a territory, however you want to frame it. But probably in practice, I find also different ways of approaching this. So, for example, indigenous peoples teach us to relate to the environment in a more embodied way, like learning to fish, learning to farm, and to relate to the environment in an everyday way. But also we can think of other ways of relating to the environment that keep this respect. For example, I don't know, through GIS technologies, mapping, like, for example, how nature evolves and transforms, and allowing for that mapping or that information to be incorporated in our designs. That can be also a different way of allowing nature to transform what we do. There are probably many other forms of relationship, and I think that your question is very keen in the sense that we must first recognize that multiplicity, that plurality of relationships, but also at the same time recognize that even if we don't want to, non-humans and nature will affect our design in the end. For example, in climate change, that is very explicit. Right?
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for your question, for your answer, and Bubai for your question in this case. So now I see we were missing one question in the middle from Daniel, who is a beauty student right now, and I see he's here. So if you want to make your question directly to Claudia, Daniel, that would be very good. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is about the food security and low hunger. According to some point of views, the problem is not the quantity, but the quality and even more the affordability of food, mainly in vulnerable sectors or the poorest area, mainly in rural areas. What do you think about this current idea and the idea of abundance that you mentioned? According to the Sustainable Development Goals of Zero Hunger target by 2030?
Yes, I think this idea of abundance is a way to understand the food system problem, because there is a lot of waste, of course, but because also we don't consider the kind of extra cost of producing food at the large scale, like the pollution and yeah, the environmental problems associated to that. I think the issue with climate change, yeah, of course, there is this social issue of affordability, but the problem with climate change is that it will make everything more extreme. One of the main issues actually will be food scarcity that is already happening in some places. That is why there has been already, there is happening displacement in some countries in Africa and so on. And I have also to say, like in Colombia, recently there was a discussion because according to the FAO, I forgot the name in English, but it's yeah, sorry, FAO, the Food Organization for Agriculture. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't remember now. But according to this report, Colombia faces food insecurity, and there was all this political discussion because they said we have enough land and how this is happening. There are places that are worse, but yeah, of course, is this problem also with immigration from Venezuela and internal displacement that is still happening. So I think, yeah, there is scarcity and the problem of abundance is related with this global issue system and of course neoliberal system that is behind that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are mindful of time, so we are going to reply these 3 last questions that there are in the Q&A section, but probably we will end it there because it's already 12:30, which was the time we were supposed to be finished. So there's a question from Rohit, another DPU alumni, to Alejandro. He says, it's very interesting how rivers are personified as female gods in India and how people worship them and also dump wastes in them at the same time. I was keen to hear your thoughts, particularly on the intersection of urban and non-urban, when it comes to thinking about urban design as a political process. While supporting as collaborators, facilitators, how can one reconcile between indigenous communities' way of living and the newer modes of living in urban areas? Co-creation or participation can often be tokenistic and messy in its process, and for it to translate towards the intended vision, how can one ensure that the agency remains with the right stakeholder? Thank you, Rohit, for your question.
Thank you, Rohit. A very complex question, I think, and I'm very sure that we don't have the answer here, but I'll try to reflect on that. I think that I mean, as that designers become collaborators or facilitators is already a big step it's already a big difference from what mainstream urban design does. So if we already if designers can start taking that role seriously as facilitators instead of being the authors of the design, that is already a big step in the process. But then how can designers reconcile, for example, between indigenous cosmovisions and the needs of urban areas? I think that is something that still needs to be invented, so to say, because there are many lessons from indigenous peoples and from other communities in urban areas, or from activists, environmental activists, for example, that can teach us to have more sustainable urban lives, but there is still a bridge to be. I mean, there is still translations and new things to be created. And for example, something that was quoted here that is a work by Vanessa Castambroto, this idea, for example, of innovative reparations, is probably a way of thinking that through, of incorporating other principles in how urban design can perform, and that is something that I think still needs to be created. And regarding co-creation and participation, I think that it's very difficult to ensure that agency remains in a particular stakeholder. I think that regarding participation and creation, control is probably something that is very difficult or not ideal to try to portray. But I think that there are many principles, for example, of cultural humanity and also ethical principles. The part that has, for example, created a new ethics guideline for the built environment that has many interesting principles of how designers can start developing new ethical stances for co-creating or developing participation in the built environment. So that is probably something. So starting with those principles is probably a way through avoiding this tokenistic or probably like violent processes that sometimes misdeveloped participation can develop, right?
Thank you, Alejandro. Very complex questions, but you are always there on the right side. So we have other two questions, which I'm going to read them both because they are not directed to anyone specifically. So then feel free to reply. So a question from Omar, another PUDD alumnus. Hey all, thank you for your presentations. Going forward, what do you think the role of urban design should be in relation to ideas of growth and urbanization, specifically in relation to the idea of rehearthing? And the last question we have says, within regeneration cycles, there is an effort to completely gentrify Somerstown and force the Bangladeshi community out of the area. Are these kind of growing projects permanent enough to empower the community and stop developers on porting them quite literally in the future? Espara? Sorry. Martina. Oh, that last question was for Martina, while the Omar's question can be replied by anyone.
I'm happy to jump onto the Somerstown one unless anyone wanted to say anything for the other one first.
Please,
okay.
Go ahead.
Again, I think it's a really complex question. I think that, yeah, I think there's so many different factors at play when you look at regeneration, and especially in an area like Somerstown, which has such an insanely high land value. But I think what our projects, what our programs, if you like, aim to do is to foster those relationships, to kind of enable bringing the Bangladeshi community and other communities in the area also into those conversations with institutions, with developers, with the council. So it's very much that those local people are actually part of that change that's happening and part of those conversations and have kind of an active stake in it quite often, which is very difficult to do. But I think, and it does sometimes come down to individuals as well, of kind of, unfortunately, often the people with the loudest voices are the ones that get heard. So I think it's also about trying to balance that and ensure that there's more opportunities for those kind of meetings and conversations and relationships to happen in the area. I mean, we work really closely with kind of Somerstown Community Association, with the different TRAs for the estates there, with various different kind of quite active local groups. And then at the same time, we'll have these other conversations with essentially the powers that be a little bit, with the kind of the people making the final decisions and putting the money there. And I think it's being able to kind of navigate between those two worlds and try and ensure that the local voice doesn't get lost. And I think for us, it's kind of the environment. I mean, the charity's very much started with the environmental education as the aim, but I think it's kind of grown to be a bit more than that. And it is a bit more about sort of social justice in these areas, and with nature as well being one of those kind of active participants, as Alejandro was speaking about, and how do we ensure that these spaces and the way that these areas are developed actually have that all those different groups have a right to be part of that conversation.
Thank you, Martina. I don't know if Claudia or Alejandro want to give some answer about your thoughts on the role of urban design in relation to these alternatives to growing urbanization and the idea of reearthing.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question because, of course, you may want to go for degrow, and it's kind of difficult because you still need to, to work under the existing condition, and then you have students that when they finish, they will go and find a job, and there are all these forces behind that you cannot, combat. But I still think design has this potential of, and the urban designer to be the mediator between these different needs, and you really need to commit to bring this all different needs to the table, and find the kind of balance. And I think also more like this. I think what Martina has been doing is a good example of the role of urban design, and how it can be really about mediation, and and I think also we really have the skills of understanding space and systems and ecological systems, and this is our expertise that we also have to be able to use it, because there is also this discussion, like sometimes urban designers are kind of shifting towards other fields that are not their expertise. So I think we still have a very important role in shaping the form of the city, but also in being mediators between the different needs.
Thank you very much. I want to close now. Thanking everyone. Alejandro, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just one quick thought, because that is something that by watching Martina's presentation I was thinking about, and I just have like some reflections on questions, and it's like, how can we decommodify these spaces? Because like Martina said, the land value, for example, in the place that they're running the project is a factor to take into account, and it would be a shame that it becomes developed afterwards, and that space and those activities and those relationships are lost. So I think that urban designers, I think that we must start thinking also on getting and starting doing influence, or even creating policy and regulation, like bridging our practice also with urban planning and urban regulations, because probably that is a way to challenge the structural way that the cities are developed, right? So I think that even if our practices are very related to development with communities and others, I think that there is a space and a need for urban designers also to engage with policy, with regulation, and challenging how the trajectories of urbanization are happening right now.
Thank you, Alejandro. And I will again thank you all. This has been an amazing discussion. I think, as Alejandro said and Claudia pointed out, and Martina has shown us today, we have like an important role in really like creating prototypes and alternatives for systemic change. We're not going to change the world at a time, like all at one time, but there's many ways in which we really can like be conscious of how design has participated in the current system and has the power to also transform and have a positive transformation to a different system. So I'll give the floor to Laia to close this amazing time that we had in this space with all of you.
Thank you, Natalia. So nothing, I just want to thank you everyone who joined us today, our students, the community of our alumni who I see are all there listening, and those who are sharing their experiences with us. I think it is very inspiring to see how, after going through the BUDD, to see how everyone is applying the knowledge in different contexts and how we can keep sharing our knowledge through this type of events. So really, thank you very much, Alejandro and Claudia, for being with us so early. And thank you very much, Martina, as well, for sharing your experience and the work you are doing in London. I think everyone has been very fascinated about this. So to close this, sorry, we are in the same room, so it's challenging. So to close this, I want to remind that next week we have our last Urban Design Otherwise event, which will be a walking tour in London. It will be about diasporic geographies, which is a topic we are starting to work with also forward for our field trip in Sheffield. And we have named it specifically Voices from the South, because we want to bring the voice to those from the global South, but also to those living in South London, who are the Latino community and the Caribbean communities. We will visit in Elephant and Castle and Brixton. So we will have as well some of our alumni showing us and making this tour with us to learn more about how the voices from those communities living in the Stoom neighborhoods are being listened and how are they shaping urban design in our cities. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and we hope to see you in the next time we keep up with the urban design conversations. Have a lovely day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.